think they're not going to come for you when you start attacking the US dollar? Wake up. I mean, if we're going to get heavy about this, what is the point? What is the point of a blockchain? What's the one thing that the blockchain does that nothing else does? The decentralization bit sort of started to get pushed under a bit. And the truth is that there is no point to any of this if it's not decentralized.
I'm sure you read Bitcoin white paper, right? So what was one that stood out to you?
You start to question the very fabric of the society you live in.
Supported by IGRA Labs Atomic Programmability on a Casper blog tag.
Cascade. Use your Casper without selling it.
Today, I'm joined by Paddy from Minima. Paddy, I've been looking forward to this discussion. Good to have you here.
No, thank you so much, Ankit, for having me on your wonderful show. My pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome. So let me set some context here, right? Some of Casper community members actually reached out to us and they wanted us to meet to chat to you. So kudos to those guys, and I'm glad you're here. So let me quickly do a Minima introduction, and then I want you to explain what Minima is, right? So from my perspective, Minima is a proof of work layer 1 with no miners, no mining rewards, obviously no stakers, no validators, and the craziest part, every device or edge runs a node. That's how I define it. How do you define Minima?
I define Minima as the ultimate in decentralized technology. So, way back when, Satoshi showed us something incredible, and he came up with this piece of technology, Bitcoin, and it really changed the world. And it did something that we have never been able to do before, which is it gave us the ability to come to consensus in a decentralized way, decentralization. And somewhere along the way, in all the money and the hype and the love and all of this, the decentralization bit sort of started to get pushed under a bit. And the truth is that there is no point to any of this if it's not decentralized. And so when we started Minima, we were like, look, if we actually want this to remain decentralized, what are the things that we have to do? And it was really sort of, there's only one issue that I have with Bitcoin. It's a big issue, but there's only one issue that I have with it, and Minima fixes that issue as far as I'm concerned. So it wasn't about the scripting language. It wasn't about the speed of the blocks, the size of the blocks. I sort of see a lot of the chains out there as, small tweaks to the initial parameters. They took it and they said, look, we need this, that. But actually none of them addressed the one thing that mattered to me, which was that the larger these chains get, the more centralized they become. All of these chains, the bigger they get, the more centralized they get. And unfortunately, this applies to, this is the stakers, the miners, the validators, whatever you want to call it. Because these games that we play, because a blockchain is basically a game played by people finding blocks, they centralize, they're competitions. Humans are top predator. We're excellent at competition. And in a competition, there's always a winner. And when somebody wins the game of mining, your chain is dead, because that completely defeats the object of, the point of this. And so Minima is designed in a way that it never centralizes. The larger Minima gets, the more decentralized it gets. And if I'm just in one sentence, what it is that Minima does that is different to all the others is that we don't have a Coinbase transaction. That's literally the secret sauce, which means that you are not financially incentivized to find blocks. You're incentivized to mine the network because you're protecting your coins. When I run Minima, I'm protecting my coins. And when you run Minima, you're protecting your coins. And theoretically, me and you play a cooperative game, not a competitive game. And in a competitive game, it's called a win-lose scenario. When somebody finds a block, somebody doesn't find a block, they win, this other guy loses. Whereas when we play this game on Minima, what's good for me is good for you. And what's good for you is good for me. So it's a competitive environment. And this had ramifications. If you want everybody to be able to mine the chain, whether or not they're getting paid or not, Yeah. If you say, look, I need you to do some work or I'm going to disconnect from the network, this has ramifications. This means, well, look, how is everybody going to be able to run this? And, I can't expect them to run it on on a Kubernetes cluster. I can't expect them to have a server. I can't even expect them to have a laptop or a computer. Billions of people don't have access to this, but what they do have access to is your mobile phone. So it has to run on your mobile phone. And then that has ramifications because it's like, how am I going to squeeze these databases and how am I going to do this and how much work and blah, blah, blah. And everything starts from, we have to remain decentralized. Nothing else matters. I mean, if we're going to get heavy about this, yeah, what is the point? What is the point of a blockchain? What's the one thing that the blockchain does that nothing else does? What is it? You tell me, Ankit.
Oh, you asking me, what is the one thing that blockchain does?
One thing that the blockchain gives you that nothing else does.
Well, it's public ledger, I would say, right? It's the public ledger.
I can have a read-only MySQL replica database. If I got a database, I could let you access it. I could say, look, you got read access to it.
Well, I would say then I'll take a next step. It's the honest public ledger, right?
No.
Still not? Okay. So what is the one thing you tell me?
It's not the scripting. Yeah. The entire Ethereum network, I could run it on my one AWS server. It's not the speed, because frankly, blockchains are incredibly slow and clunky and expensive. It's not the convenience, because, contactless Visa cards are pretty hard to beat, frankly. The one thing that a blockchain does, the only value proposition of a blockchain, is censorship resistance. That's it. That's the only reason you use a blockchain, because for everything else, it's terrible. It's really slow. It's really clunky. It's very expensive comparatively. Yeah. Consider the Bitcoin network has hundreds of millions of dollars spent running computers when you could run it all off one machine and get the same throughput, the same everything. Yeah. The reason we go through this nightmare is because it's censorship resistance. And the censorship resistance only happens if you're decentralized, because centralized systems are so easy to attack. So if you're not going to be decentralized, there's no point using a blockchain. And nobody seems to understand this. This was the bit that was forgotten along the way. And this is the bit that Minima does, which is like, you have to be decentralized. And that means sacrifice. That means you have to give things up. You don't get to be Ethereum with 2 terabytes and all this blobs of data. You don't get that if you want to remain decentralized, if you want everybody to run it. But that's the only thing we're doing here. We're making sure no one can stop you transacting. We're making sure I can't dilute the money. Yeah. Minima is a fixed cap. I can't, that is a form of censorship when somebody prints money, and you don't have control over that. So you can't have anybody in charge. That's the only reason we're here. And so that's why decentralization matters. Yeah. That's it.
Right.
Everything else is bonus. As much as you can squeeze out of this blood, as much blood as you can get out of this stone, that's fine, but it has to be decentralized. Otherwise you failed. And I'm looking at all the other blockchains out there. I mean, let's be honest, Ankit. Something's happening at the moment, yeah? Like what's happened? What's the big story of this year? The big story of this year is that, can I say it? Shall I say it? I'm saying it. Crypto's dead. Crypto's dead. There's a new kid on the blockchain. Yeah, there's a new kid on the block. His name's AI. And all the people that were here trying to, grift and make money are now like, I try to make money out of this. Now I'm going to trade money out of that.
Yeah.
So frankly, crypto as it was is over. There's no ICOs. People aren't excited about new chains. And look, I'm smiling about this. You know why I'm smiling? Because that's good. Because 99.9% of this stuff is complete rubbish. Yeah. 99% of the crypto industry was garbage. And that's fine. And now we've reached that point, you can feel it. You can sense it. There just isn't that excitement about it anymore. And so now the truth is going to emerge. Now the actual things that matter are going to start to bubble to the top. And the only thing that matters, as I've said to you, why would I do something on a blockchain that I can do on a website and, they're not going to stop me doing? If I want to do something and I'm allowed to do it, then I'll do it. That's fine. But money, which is the ultimate use case, which is why Bitcoin does so well, is constantly attacked by everybody. Everybody wants to be in charge of the money. That's like it drives everything. It is the de facto base of the entire planet. So everybody wants to be in charge of that. And all these other chains that sort of came up with stuff, Ethereum, which I love. I think Ethereum did so much good. Vitalik's a smart guy. They've done some fantastic work. But like I was using MetaMask the other day and I tried to do a swap and they asked for KYC. And I was like, what? That's it. You're done. That's over. I can never use you again. You sold out. It must, KYC is a scam. All you ever do with KYC is basically give your details to the eventual hackers who get into that system and get it. And it's like, look, you've got to realize that we're trying to build something here that is not controlled by anybody. We're trying to come up with something which is outside of the scope of people. And I think what it is that it's hard to extract value now from that proposition. It's hard to come up with something. People want to make money. That's fine. That's great. That's a great incentive. That has driven this industry for so long. But now you really need to think about, what are the actual reasons I'm using this? What are the actual use cases? And obviously, I think Minima is wonderfully positioned for this. I think we do something that no single other blockchain does. Like no other blockchain does it. And this is weird. No other blockchain does it the way Minima does it. So I'll take that Pepsi challenge. Ethereum, Cardano, Polkadot, just like garbage. Just centralized. The 17 people who run those chains. That would take the American government one evening to shut down if they wanted to. I'm just saying, they spend $2 trillion a year on defense. You think they're not going to come for you when you start attacking the US dollar? Wake up. There's no way they're going to allow this. So you need to be in a situation where no one's in charge, where no one can attack you. And that's what we're trying to do here. That's, freedom, sir.
That's beautiful. I wasn't expecting you to unravel that, but that's beautiful what you just said. So let me take a step back, right? And I think all the points you mentioned, all the things you mentioned, clearly shows the passion you have for this industry, right? It just shows. So, but let me take a step back. I was going to say, I've spoken to a lot of builders. They really think Ethereum is truly decentralized because they have the most number of validators, right? I've spoken to Bitcoin folks. They are obviously, they think because Bitcoin is Bitcoin, right? You cannot compete. It's the number one asset, right? So it's a sliding scale. But oftentimes, normal people I talk to, they really focus on who owns the coins.
Proof of stake chain, that matters, obviously, because proof of stake, it's really weird because you sort of think that they would understand that if you want to combat centralization, you don't want to put the people in charge, the people with in charge of the chain. The chain needs to be apolitical, agnostic. It needs to run whatever. Look at Salek. He's got a lot of coins. He doesn't have influence over the running of the chain. He's a wealthy guy and he's got money and he can spend money, and that's good. But he doesn't get to dictate which blocks are made, which transactions get into the blocks. That's what we're trying to stop here. Access to the block has to be censorship resistant. And like when you look at the Nakamoto consensus for these chains, you look at Cardano and it's like, we're on we've got 120. For a global chain, there's 120 people that are important. And if you attack those 120, it's over. It's like, are you kidding me? I want 1 million people. I want 1 billion people. These are the sort of numbers we need to talk about here. If you're actually going to come up with a chain that, in the current world as it is, which is a pretty weird there's a lot of stuff going on. Let's not get too political about this, but if you want Russia to sit down at a table with America, to sit down at a table with China, to sit down at a table with, with the Iranians and the Israelis, they've all got to know no one can ever screw with this system. This system has to be outside of the control of any of you. And that is, that cracking, 20 years from now, how many miners are there going to be? Because if there's 3 miners, and like when you have an industry, we have had 10,000 industries in humanity's history. So we know what happens with industry. We've seen it happen 1,000 times, 10,000 times. You always get a monopoly. That's just how it works. Because economies of scale kick in, because I'm bigger than you, stuff is cheaper for me, I can now become even bigger than you, blah, 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 blah. And it's like every single other industry, mining industry, gold, oil, silver, any of these, there's 3 miners who own everything. And that's the death of your blockchain. You cannot have that. You cannot have 3 people who can decide amongst themselves, you're not allowed to put the transactions from Tornado Cash. You're not allowed to access this address because it's on a bad website. You have to remove yourself from that discussion. This is like water. This is like a utility. This is something that everybody has to have access to, because the truth is, I cannot be free if you are not. Whenever you have this discussion, I know it's really difficult to extract yourself. And when you say, look, what about the bad people who do bad things? And it's like, am I allowed to have a private conversation? Am I allowed to have a private conversation with my friend? And they go, yeah, of course you are. And I'm like, okay, but are the bad people allowed to have bad conversations with their friends? And they're like, no. And I'm like, so how are you going to tell whether I'm having a bad conversation or a good conversation? And the only answer is, well, I'm going to listen in. And it's like, well, you're not allowed to listen in because I'm meant to be having a private conversation. Freedom is a two-way street. And so you can attack the problem of bad people, but you don't fix it by attacking the money. Yeah. This is the point. The base layer has to be free for everybody, agnostically, apolitically. And then the stuff on top of that, we can work on that. We can, donate money to causes that fight the things that you believe in. Hire people, choose governments that do what you want. There are different ways of attacking this problem, but they always say, you've got to lose your freedoms so that I can get them. And it's like, that's the wrong attitude. The attitude which says 99% of people have to lose their access to something just so that I can get the 1%, which is what always happens, is the wrong way of doing this. And that's what crypto has sort of shown us. We have the ability now to have a system where we can all be free, and then together we can work on that 1%.
I think what you're talking about is perhaps even wider than blockchain. Would you say that, something like Bitcoin that has 70,000 nodes, or, Caspa with 1,000 nodes, right?
It has 70,000 nodes, but it only has 20 or 30 miners. As in they own, doesn't matter how many miners or validators you have. It only matters how big the cartel that controls 51% is. You can have 1 million miners, but if 3 of them control 51%, you have 3 miners. Yeah. How big's the cartel that owns 51% is the metric that matters.
So what is the number for you? Do you have a number? Because obviously we're leading to minima here.
No, somewhere between, funnily enough, we don't actually, so 50 to 100,000, somewhere in that number. We don't have any data on that. Yeah. I don't know. We have no data. We have no logic or no code that tells us who's running it. I can tell from how many downloads we get and this sort of stuff, but it's like the more users we get, the more miners we get because everybody mines. And importantly, you're not incentivized to become a big miner, which is the problem. The problem is that if I was being paid, I'd buy big computers. Who wouldn't? It's funny because this is not even, I'm not saying people are bad. It's the system that incentivizes, show me the incentives, I'll show you the end game. And if you say, I'll pay you to get bigger computers, I'll get bigger computers. I'm paying you to acquire the weaponry required to attack my network. It's like, that can't be right. That's going to fail. Yeah. So it's like, I need a system which doesn't incentivize you to buy the equipment required to attack the network. You mine the network because you're protecting your coins. And I do a little bit of work and you do a little bit of work. And together we both mine and we both help in building this blockchain. And I agree with you where at the beginning, there was a lot of this sort of freedom talk and chat, back on Bitcoin talk and all of this. And some of that has definitely been swept under the carpet now, now that we're all ETF and like TradFi and money and all of this stuff. But
it's all paper, right? It's all paper. Yeah.
This is the stuff that pervades the entire industry. We're trying to change the whole world here. Clearly something's wrong, the way the governments operate. When I try to explain to my children, what is happening, how are they affording this war? It's because they can just print money and they steal it from you without you even knowing it's happening. I know people get annoyed when you say, oh, there won't be any war on our Bitcoin standard. And it's like, well, I'm going to say there's going to be a lot less of it. If you actually have to pay for this, if once you understand this very simple sentence, which, sort of sounds like a meme, but is actually true, which is fix the money, fix the world.
Fix the world.
That is very, very powerful sentence because
100%.
Money underpins everything, and I don't mean that in a sort of nasty way. I'm not trying to say poor people don't matter and rich people do and all of that, but money underpins everything. It is a technology. It is the one technology. This idea that I can somehow abstract my labor, time, labor, the amount of time doing what I do is worth some amount of money. And this underpins everything so that we can somehow divide, usefulness and work. Yeah. And that's broken at the moment. So things that are useless get paid a lot of money. And it's like, why are they making money? Yeah, they shouldn't be making money. They're making money because the system's broken and they got politicians in their pocket and they make weapons. And so they're the lobbying and blah, blah, blah. No, fix this. And we, humans are incredible creatures. We will sort this out. We want the cream to rise to the top. I want people to be wealthy who deserve it. I want people who are entrepreneurial, productive, they should be rewarded for their efforts and their time. But we're living in a system which currently doesn't do that. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to reach the pinnacle of humanity. We're trying to do something cool here. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I was going to say, it's, I think what you're defining is true capitalism. I think what I believe, it's along the way, I think we've lost true capitalism, right? True competition.
Everybody hates capitalism. They think this is the capitalist world we live in and it's awful. And it's like,
different. Yeah.
Absolutely not a capitalist world we live in. We live in a sort of socialist capitalism. We live in a capitalism for the rich and socialism for the poor. And it's like, it's just not a fair system that applies to everybody equally. And you want a pure capitalist system. Yeah. And that's not the world we live in.
No, unfortunately not. And I think a lot of people don't understand that if capitalism was truly capitalism, I think we'll be prosperous world. People will be prospering across the globe, not just some pockets.
Absolutely.
Right. But I do want to ask you one thing, though. I think you asked me one thing earlier, so I want to ask you one other question. Right. I'm sure you read Bitcoin white paper, right? So, what was one that stood out to you? Because there was one thing that really stood out to me. Of course, everyone has the different take on white paper. What's your take?
He didn't mention scripting in the white paper, and that was totally cool. And it's like, ooh.
I see. I'll tell you one thing that stood out to me, which I think almost everyone I've spoken to doesn't care about it, which is double spending, right? That's for me, after I read the white paper, of course, there's a lot of, things you need to understand, but double spending is one of the most fundamental issues that almost everyone ignores. And we almost rushing to that now, right? With, ETFs and everything. Exactly.
But we didn't have a solution to it.
2008.
Yeah, I agree. And that was something that we just couldn't do before. I mean, they always talk about this Byzantine generals problem, and it's a little bit abstract and people are sort of confused by it. But it's like, how do you get everyone to agree on something? Everyone to agree. I mean, really what it is a clock. Yeah. At its absolute simplest basic core, how do you come up with a clock that everybody agrees on, and you don't have a central point? Yeah. And before Bitcoin, you always had to have a central point that said, no, this is the time. No, well, this guy, he'll tell you the time, and then you can do everything. And, that worked. But you could get to that guy or whoever was in charge or that center, and you could muck about with it. And how can we do it without having a center? How can we come up with, this is the first event, this is the second event, this is the third event? And that is the thing that it created, this clock that just block. And it's so brilliant. I mean, it's the most incredible piece of technology. I'm a coder. Yeah, I've been coding for 30 years. It's funny because I sort of think that at the moment, we're all of us coders are having a sort of slight existential crisis at the moment. With Claude and Anthropic and all of this. And, was this period in history, this 50 years where you were coding? Yeah, I started coding on the ZX Spectrum. Yeah, and that was like 40 years ago, I started coding on the Spectrum. And I think that's I'm going to say that's when it started. Yeah, when the home scene started, it wasn't like a supercomputer. And I'm witnessing like the complete destruction of the entire coding scene at the moment. Yeah. And whether this was just a sort of blip where we were allowed to be, and now you're not going to be doing it anymore. I mean, if you ask me, I don't know if there's no new coders coming.
No.
Yeah, there'll be an over period where there's us old dogs and the new stuff. But 15, 20 years from now, there won't. But when Bitcoin came out, it just blew my mind. It blew everybody's mind because it touches so many things. Saylor's right when he says you need to spend 1,000 hours just down that rabbit hole. The Bitcoin rabbit hole is deep.
Yeah.
And money is this incredible incentive to get you interested in it. Everybody thinks they're going to make money, and that's great. Get involved because you think you're going to make money. But actually, it holds a mirror up to the world. And you start to ask yourself questions like, why do I need this? I've got Visa, and then you start to question the very fabric of the society you live in. And all this other stuff appears in a sort of revolutionary way, like the 60s. It's like, and this is something so powerful that I think it is going to transform the world. And I think what you said, which was interesting, Ankit, is that I'm an optimist. Yeah. Humans are good. Yeah. 99% of us are good people. Yeah, there's always the 1%. I don't know. And also, I don't believe in blame. something happened to these people to make them the way they are. They don't think the way you do. They do nasty things, whatever. But it's like, in general, we're good people. And if you gave us a game that we could all play together fairly, I agree that we're going to come out with, something incredible, something good, something where the most of us are going to be having incredible time. Yeah. And this is what has been born in 2008. And now is sort of, it was sort of reaching a sort of, 20 years, actually about 20 years. Yeah. We're almost at 20 years for this technology to sort of mature, like the internet. Yeah. And it's like, okay, it's becoming ingrained in society, but the effects of this are literally going to be felt for millennia. Yeah. Like if we do this now, this is the next 1,000 years, a golden age of humanity is ahead of us because of what happened there.
So many snippets. You're giving me so many snippets here, huh, Patty?
Right.
So let's discuss this. I guess we're not just talking about decentralization. We're talking about this ultra, decentralization. I would just coin this term now because I think people constantly discuss decentralization, but I think what you're talking about is pure decentralization. This ultra decentralization, right? So let me ask you, coming back to, I guess, Minima's core principles, how do you actually achieve this ultra / pure decentralization? What are the things you guys have done and how you managed to achieve this, I guess?
Okay. So from a technical level, as I said, if you start with the premise that it's like, look, everybody has to run this.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody.
Right.
They all have to run it in the same way. So then you think to yourself, okay, so what am I going to make it run on? And you're like, okay, so I guess the only thing I can reasonably expect people to have is a mobile phone. And so you go, okay, so it's got to run on a mobile phone. And then you're like, okay, but how am I going to fit this massive database on a mobile phone? Yeah, these blockchains have got huge databases. But again, restriction is the mother of, necessity is the mother of invention. And you're like, okay, so you can work with this. And actually, if you look back across the battlefield of blockchains, there have been many wonderful inventions that have come out of this. I mean, there's so much great maths and tech and code that's come out of all of this. And one of these things was a proof database. The first time I saw it was Peter Todd did something on Bitcoin Talk, and he called it an MMR database. And basically what that does is it says, look, instead of everybody storing everything, why don't I come up with a database where if I've got coins and you've got coins, when I want to spend my coins, I'm the only one that can access them. And when you want to spend your coins, you're the only one that can access them. So can't I come up with a system where I store my coins, and when I want to spend them, I add some maths proof to their existence. And then when you want to spend, because then when I send the transaction, you can go, oh, look, I didn't know these coins existed, but here's the proof. And so I can tell that he really, and it's all done with Merkle trees and branches and mathematics and blah, blah, blah. And so that's like, okay, so you can do that. And it's like, yeah, you can do that. And so what that means is that on the Minima network, everybody stores what matters to them and proves to the network when they want to spend those coins. And so we call it a proof database, and that's how Minima runs. And that basically means that I can have a trillion terabyte database, but I only store 10 megabytes.
Right.
And you only store 10 megabytes. Together, every user on the network, if you had all of that data, then you would have the complete set of the database. But I don't need to store all of your stuff. Yeah. Now I check every transaction that comes in. Yeah. Right. I make sure that every transaction is valid. And so the database is updated in terms of there's basically a root hash to the database. You hash the database. This is the root. Everybody's got Merkle branches that point to the root, so nobody can spend coins that don't exist. And it was like, wow, okay, so we can do that. We can't. So why would we go for proof of work versus proof of stake? Proof of work is so simple. It's so elegant. Proof of stake is incredibly, people think proof of stake is easy. It's not, it's complicated. Yeah. Try looking at the beacon chain on Ethereum. Oh my God. I'm a semi-clever dude and I can look at this stuff and it's like, I don't even understand it. I mean, I do, but it's just like, no one's going to be able to copy this. We've reached the point where technically so massive, no individual, maybe an AI, but no individual is going to be able to replicate that. Whereas, for instance, you need to keep this simple on an implementational level. You need to make it possible that there are multiple implementations, that one person can't get his head around how does the whole thing work. So we've got this chain, we squeeze it onto your phone. We make sure that, I can't be using all this electricity to mine. Yeah, my phone can't handle that. So what can we do about that? And it's like, well, on normal proof of work chains, you have massive computers doing massive amounts of work, but you've only got 3 of them. And it's like, okay, so what if we said instead of 3, I've got 10 million small miners, each doing a teeny bit of work? Is that the same thing? And it's like, yeah, that'd work. Yeah. Proof of work, really good at distributing itself like this. Back in the day, there was a pooling system called P2Pool. I don't know if you know about this, but this was it was a completely decentralized pool where everybody would do some work and you could prove to everybody how much work you'd done. And then if you found a block, then you would post it on the network. But if you didn't find a block, then we would basically be mining on a separate little blockchain, but we all paid anybody who did some work beforehand. Minima is basically one massive P2 pool. Yeah, where everybody does a little bit of work. And then eventually somebody actually finds a block and that gets published and everybody realizes that that's real and blah, blah, blah. So you're like, oh, okay, that's fine. But again, as I mentioned, you do have to make some sacrifices. Yeah. So I can't have 10,000 transactions per second. Yeah. Because I need it to run on your phone. But then you think, but do I need 10,000 transactions per second? And this is another thing. So you're thinking layer 1 is not where you scale. Yeah. Layer 1 is where the decentralized consensus comes in. So that needs to be as lean and as mean and as clean as possible. The scale comes in on layer 2. And if you look at all the layer 2s that are out there, I'm sorry to say, there's only one layer 2 technology that actually works at scale. And when I say scale, I mean any amount of transactions. The AIs are going to need millions of transactions per second, millions of transactions, not 10,000, not 100, billions.
Billions, yeah.
What's the one technology, layer 2, that actually scales and remains decentralized? Like Coinbase scales, but it's totally centralized. Yeah, Coinbase allows you to do transactions very fast. They've got big servers, but it's totally centralized, totally censorable. That's fine. What's the technology?
I can't think of any. Layer 2 that's decentralized.
There's only one. No, there's 2. There's the one Minima and there's the one Bitcoin uses.
But Bitcoin, layer 1, not layer 2, right?
It's Lightning. Lightning is total genius. Lightning is such a great piece of tech. And I know Lightning is a really, really clever piece of tech because it's scalable and decentralized and permissionless, which means that any 2 people can start a Lightning channel. Anybody can start using this tech. It's almost like if there's somebody in charge, it didn't work. If there's somebody running your chain, if I'm looking at a layer 2 on Ethereum, it's like, who runs that? What happens if they disappear? Where's my money gone? That can't work. It's almost like it has to be a protocol. It has to be something that me and you can do without having to speak to anybody else. And that's what Lightning gives you. So you don't have to have 10,000 transactions per second on layer 1. You need to have 1 million transactions per second on layer 2.
Right.
And so Minima, again, having the benefit of hindsight, can look back and go, God, so if I really wanted to come up with the best Lightning network I could, there is a better version of Lightning called L2, which we're desperately trying to get onto Bitcoin. And I don't know if we're going to be able to, all this Bit 110 nonsense and blah, blah, blah. But if you could choose to start from scratch and it's like, what am I going to use as my layer 2? You just need to have a couple of clever functions. You just need a few little things that you can do on layer 1 and you get L2 Lightning. Minima does that. Minima gives us that ability. We can have a proper Lightning network.
Interesting.
In fact, if I may just talk about
please. Yeah.
Second. The problem with Lightning is the complexity of managing the channels. I don't know if you know about Lightning, but you have to have channels. And
I know. Yeah,
I've
got so many thoughts. Like while you're discussing this, I was like, I've got so many things to add here, but I'll let you speak first. please carry on. Yeah.
So the problem with Lightning, if you ask me, the reason it hasn't taken off is not because the technology doesn't work, because it does. It's really good. And it's the only technology that can actually handle the amount of traffic we kind of need. It's the complexity of managing all the channels. I've tried to run a Lightning node. It's complicated in terms of I need to have a channel and a this, and I need to rebalance, and I need to send money backwards and here. And it's like, whether I can do it is irrelevant. It's whether my mother can do it, whether somebody else can do it, and whether they can do it independently. Is there something that could help us to do that today? Is there some technology now, some sort of droney AI that could manage the channels for us? And it's like, oh yeah, you could use an AI to do it. And actually, they'd be perfect for this. They're very good at that sort of and, looking at data, repetitive tasks, sort of data analysis. They're really good at that. Whether they're good at chatting is another thing, but they're really good at that. So actually, I think this is going to be a real golden era in terms of setting up this complicated supra network of channels, which allows us all to pay each other. So I think that issue has been solved now, in my honest opinion. So that's the scalable technology that, Minima uses that. That's the way Minima does its layer 2. And, other things as well. But yeah, there were decisions that had to be made that all sprang from, it's got to stay decentralized. And once you start with that, sort of things logically just pop out, as in it has to do that.
I guess just quickly, discussing Lightning itself, right? I mean, Lightning is very, very interesting. Of course, it does scale. It's layer 2. I think that's the first thing I would say is Bitcoiners typically talk about Lightning being being Bitcoin. I don't agree on that. I think it's a totally different layer 2. It's not Bitcoin. It's not designed to
be Bitcoin because it's Bitcoin transactions. It is Bitcoin. Correct. It is Bitcoin. You have a valid Bitcoin transaction. The only thing that Lightning does is it says, I haven't posted the latest transaction.
Well, yes, but it's not transaction, though, I must say. There is no transaction. It's IOU. There is no transaction. It's only locked up in the Bitcoin layer 1. Your Bitcoin, right? Rest is actually not moving. Coins are not moving. That's true. Yeah.
No, I'm good.
So please tell me, correct?
I have. When I'm doing a Lightning transaction with you, I have some coins on layer 1 locked up in some smart contract.
Right. Yes.
And I have a valid transaction that I can publish myself independently
on the ledger,
without permission.
Not the Bitcoin.
Yeah. I have a Bitcoin transaction signed, ready, and sealed, and all I have to do is publish it. And if I don't publish it, I can keep transacting with you. Me and you can send each other money all day long. 1,000 transactions per second.
It's ledger. It's a ledger moving. It's not actual Bitcoin moving. I just wanted to clarify that part.
I'm gonna have to disagree with you here, Ankit, and say that it is Bitcoin moving because all that happens is that we keep a latest transaction, and it's like this transaction pays me on, and you, of
course,
and now now I'm paying you 1.5 and me 1.5. Oh no, now I'm paying you 2 and me 1.
Yeah.
And what the bit that Lightning does, the only thing it does is that it makes sure I can't publish a previous transaction. That's all it does, is it ensures that the latest transaction is the valid transaction. That's it. But it is a Bitcoin transaction.
It is a Bitcoin transaction. Okay, I think it's a beautiful discussion. I think we need to have an entire session with you on Lightning. But I think
I'd be happy to.
Yes, I love to have you back, I think. But let's carry on with this discussion with Minima, layer 1 first. So nodes, we get it, right? Now, coming to the miners, right? Proof of work, when you discuss proof of work, there are no miners, right? Each node
everybody's a miner.
Everybody is a miner, right? There are no specialized miners.
Yeah.
There are no specialized miner, right? So every node is a miner, is a node. Node is a node, obviously, and there's also block constructor, right? So it's all in one, basically.
Yeah, so everybody does everything. Everybody's running the whole thing. Everybody checks all the transactions. Everybody looks for a block. Everybody tries to, everybody makes sure that everybody is valid and nobody runs different software from everybody else. Yeah, we're all equal at all times. But we don't mine a lot, mine a little, tiny amount. Yeah, but I just know a lot of users. And so that a lot times a little is the same as a few miners times a lot.
100%. So then the question I wanted to ask you is, how do you achieve consensus there, right? Because now everyone is mining their own transactions. So that's the part I wanted to ask you.
I'll tell you something interesting. So the other day, Minima hit a milestone where we had 2 million blocks. We hit our 2 millionth block about 4 or 5 days ago, which I was
beautiful. Congratulations.
It was a good moment. I felt good about that. And when you think about it, mining is effectively a sort of random game. Yeah, you're basically rolling dice. Yeah, you're rolling dice. And if you roll a special sequence of dice, then you find a block. When we took the number of blocks and we divided it by the amount of time in seconds from the first block to the 2 millionth block, and we said, what was the average block time? Yeah. So the Minima blockchain tries to hit a 50-second block time. Yeah, we have a 50-second block. It was going to be a minute, but 60 doesn't divide nicely, and you get 0.033. So I did it 0.02 blocks per second. Yeah, so you get one block every 50 seconds. And when we divided the number of blocks by the amount of time, we ended up with an average block time of 50.01 seconds. And this blew my mind, because what it said is that all these different people all over the world rolling dice, a random base layer of bubbly nonsense managed to emit a block security, a block level, which was basically 0.1 of a second out over a 4-year time span. And I'm not taking credit for that. That's what beautiful. Satoshi gave us. That is the difficulty adjustment. That is what he came up with. And that is genius. Yeah, that is like unbelievable that from randomness, we managed to get something so concrete. So that is because of the difficulty adjustment, which means that if you start rolling numbers and you find too many blocks, the difficulty goes up. And so it's harder to find blocks. And then if it's like there's too big a gap, then it becomes more difficult. And so you have to roll longer. And so you find less blocks and blah, blah, blah. But the way that it works in a proof of work chain and in a proof of stake chain, really, but with the added complexity of that, is the genius bit. So, the difficulty adjustment is probably the bit that really distinguishes what Satoshi did versus what Adam Back did with Hashcash. Yeah. Hashcash, the spam prevention system, which is basically this idea that you can do some provable work. Yeah. I can actually do something which I know took you time to do digitally. It's like a connection between the real world and the digital world. This is very hard to do. In a digital world, I can copy anything. I can fake stuff. I can do stuff. And so to actually have a sort of thermodynamic coupling between the real world and the digital world is what Hashcash gave us. Yeah. He wanted to use it for spam. He was like, if you want to send me an email, I need you to do 1 second of work. And that was a really clever thing to do, because it's like one person sending one email doesn't care, but a spammer sending 1 million emails, it destroys him. I can't send 1 million emails because it's going to take 1 million seconds of work. And so he came up with this way of digitally creating a connection between the real world and what's happening in digital. And the bit that Satoshi added to that is the difficulty adjustment. So that you can only come up with, on average, a block a certain amount of time. So that's the really clever bit that Satoshi came up with. That's the clock.
That's the
difficulty adjustment.
Yes, DA, right. So let me ask you then, going back to consensus, so how does these individual blocks actually getting to the consensus that this is a legit block?
So there is censorship. There is censorship on a blockchain. You know what the censorship is? You have to be a valid block. As in, there are rules that say, these are the rules that made you a valid block. Yeah, you got to have transactions. It must be this is the order, and I have to have the block number and the time, and then I have to have a Merkle tree with all the transactions in it, and it must be of this format. You must be a valid block. Those are the rules. Consensus of the users determines whether a block is valid or not. Access to the block has to be censorship resistant. So any valid transaction is allowed to get into the block. And in fact, if we're going to take this is why the BIP 110 thing is wrong. Yeah, from a mathematical point of view, what they're trying to do is they're trying to say access, because they're trying to filter it. Yeah, they're trying, I don't know if you know about, I'm sure you do. And the BIP 110 boys are wrong, because they're saying, no, we're going to restrict, we're going to censor the ability of trying to get into a block. They're valid transactions, but we don't like them. And it's like, that's exactly what this technology was built to stop you from being able to do. Because as soon as you start saying, I don't like monkey JPEGs, the US government can say, I don't like you using Tornado Cash. Or they can say, I don't want you to use that address because it was on a bad website where bad things happen. Access to blocks must be censorship resistant. Once you're in a block, that is what consensus determines is a valid block. So there are rules, and your transactions must be valid. They must be in a certain format, and the signatures must be valid, and all of that stuff. So there is a rule that determines whether your block is valid, but access to blocks must be permissionless and censorship resistant.
Right. Okay. That is beautiful. So look, I think, so far we've established the technology, we've established the philosophy, more than technology, philosophy, I think I would say, right? So I wanted to ask you, what are the actual use cases where you've deployed Minima, right? I know you've you've talked about partnerships with major car companies. You've done some work with McLaren, GT4. So not many blockchains can really say the things you've already achieved, right? So why don't we start with like what's been the biggest use case so far of Minima?
As I mentioned earlier, money is the biggest use case. That would be 95%. Money is the use case. And for it to be money, money is a commodity. Money must require energy. This is why proof of stake is an equity. It's in the title, proof of stake. Yeah. A stake in a system is like shares in a company. I can't have a system which is based on proof of stake because there's no external work being done to make the money. Then that's not a commodity. Yeah. All this stuff about Ethereum's a commodity. It's like, it's not. It was when it was proof of work, but now that it's proof of stake, it's not. So money is the base case. Yeah. And everybody wants to be the money. I know it's tough now because Bitcoin's out there, blah, blah, blah. But then the next thing is like any censorship resistant, anything that you want to be not censored is a reason to use a blockchain. And the truth is there's no other reason for using it. So when we're doing the ICOs, and we have, NFT sales and we have DEXs and we have all of this stuff and whatever. And it's interesting because you weren't allowed to do this before. If I could have gone to a website before and just started up a company, like back in the day in 1910, whatever, when they built the New York Stock Exchange, you could turn up on the day and say, I have a company and I need to sell 10% of my company because the point was I'm trying to raise capital to make more money and then I'll pay my shareholders. It was a means, stock markets, ICOs, all of this is about raising capital so that I can work on my project and then pay people. And if they'd given us that ability, if I had that ability, I didn't. And if you actually wanted to go to the London Stock Exchange and start a company, you have to fill in forms for 6 months and pay £500,000. And the barrier to entry was massive. And that's why it was such a success, because it was like, wow, I've been censored. I'm not allowed to do this. And so that's why it worked, because it's like, hey, now I can do it. So the use case for blockchains is any technology that is anything that I'm not allowed to do, I can now do because I can do it on a blockchain. Now, another interesting case, I think, is that we have a sort of Twitter clone. Yeah, because you can send messages on the network and blah, blah, blah. And you can do stuff. And I find it interesting because, Twitter was a nightmare. And then Elon came along. I think Elon's a good guy. I don't know whether he, in history, I think when history looks back, I think he tries to be a good guy. Yeah, I think Elon's good. And X is now basically censorship resistant. You know what I mean? You can basically say what you want. And it's really interesting because then the censorship resistant networks that offered you a Twitter clone, that sort of died down a bit because it's like, I can do it over here. And so and that's the bit that people don't seem to understand. As soon as the traditional world offers us this technology because they're like, look, we've got to offer it to them because they're going to use it on this anyway. People start to use it because the truth is the centralized tech is much faster, much cheaper. Yeah. And so why wouldn't I use it? So what are the use cases of blockchain? Anything that is censored, you should be doing on a blockchain. That's really all there is to it. Those are the only reasons for using a blockchain, and there's no other reason for using it.
So what are people using Minima for? Are people actually using for money?
They use it for all the things that they normally use it on other chains. So we have an NFT marketplace, and we have DEXs, and you can make tokens, and you can do that on the tokens and all of that. I won't deny that at the moment it's tough out there. There's definitely been a downtrend because people are sort of less excited about this technology. They know that they can't just make a token and make millions of pounds out of it. So less people are trying to make this token. I play poker. I love a game of poker. Yeah. And so, I'm not saying this in a sort of, it's all the nefarious stuff and it's all the bad stuff. I don't believe in that at all. This is a freedom, man. This is a world. If you're not hurting me, I have no objections to you using it for anything. So we have a little poker app that's being worked on that people will be able to play on. So it's tough out there. I won't say that it's like easy and these people are just using it for all this stuff. But as TradFi sort of catches on and as they realize, look, we have to offer them this technology or they're just going to do it elsewhere. There are less and less use cases left out there. Money, fine. I think, ICOs, fine. Interestingly, I do think that the AIs require such a massive throughput that you're going to need some sort of technology to allow them to send each other money at speed, independently, without having anybody involved in the transaction. No human can be involved because it's got to be super fast. Visa and all of this stuff, it's still slow. It's nowhere near fast enough. Visa's like, I can do 10,000 transactions per second. And it's like, that's not enough.
No.
Yeah, there's 10,000 agents out there in one county of one country. So it is still that, the money is the main use case. Sending tokens backwards and forwards to people for something is still the majority of the use cases.
Right. But you do have partnerships with given your embedded layer one, at least that's what you call yourself.
All right. So I'll give you another one. Basically, we're trying to get this like energy thing. Yeah. So we've got cars. Yeah. The point about Minima is that we've just finished this whole project where we've managed to get Minima running on a chip. Yeah. So it's like Minima is so small because Minima is very small, frankly, and it doesn't grow. This is really the point about Minima. It doesn't matter if you're running it now or in 100 years, the size of the amount of data that you have. You check all the data as it comes in, but the amount of data you as a user store doesn't actually grow, which is, a really great feature. So we managed to get it running on a chip. And the car people are like, look, we want to have cars able to pay for energy, for electricity. And so you want to start up a network across Europe where cars can turn up and they can pay. And so what they wanted was because Minima's got a very nice, again, Minima sort of started after all of this, so we could add a lot of nice features. And so Minima, you're allowed to create tokens on the network, proper tokens, not like fake tokens. You can't really do that on Bitcoin, but you can do it on the Minima network. So we have a token which is like a joule of energy. Decentralized, which means that there's no central server that can go down and the network goes down. Yeah, the network itself is if the word I would use is resilience. Yeah, so the reason businesses like it, frankly, is not because it's censorship resistant. In fact, if I'm completely honest, I think businesses don't like censorship resistance. They want to be able to stop people from using it. But what they do like is a resilient system. And when I say that, what I mean is you don't have to run massive servers. Yeah. And the network can't go down, so that if a computer breaks, the network still operates. And so you have these tokens, these joules on your phone, and you drive to somebody's house in Europe when they have a machine outside the house, and you can pay for electricity, and that charges up your car. And that whole system sort of runs independently. Yeah. And they want to, we have Minima running on head units of cars. Nice. Yeah. Because actually a lot of head units in the Volvos and all that, they actually run on Android, a sort of stripped down version, but Minima runs on that. And so the car itself becomes this sort of independent economic unit that can sort of do stuff without anybody else being involved, you can't stop it from paying for this electricity. Yeah. And you have a really resilient sort of system which can't break. And when you tell them this, I think it takes a bit of time for them to get their head around it. Vodafone spends about $1 billion on the servers just to collect the money that you have to pay them. And if those servers go down, the whole network breaks. You don't want that. You want a network that doesn't have that single point of failure. There's no single point of failures when you're using a blockchain. Yeah. So if you have a system, so they would be the ones that sold the tokens. Yeah. This they like. Yeah. They like this. Yeah. It's like, look, you don't get the sensor, but you do get a system that can't be turned off, that operates independent from you, that, you can still extract value from it, which is what they want, the business. That's fine. But you're not on the hook. As in, if your system, if one of your computers breaks, they can put in the machines that do the charging up. You can sell those machines. You can sell the tokens that the machine accepts, blah, blah, blah. All of this stuff. Perfect. Yeah. Blockchains are great for that. This is what we're trying to do with Minima. Yeah. Because once we've got it on a chip, what I want is we put it in the toaster. And I want the toaster to pay for the electricity it uses in real time when it's toasting the bread. It pays a tenth of a penny per piece of toast. Yeah. So that, the fridge pays. So you might say, oh, but my fridge has a Visa account. And it's like, yeah, but what if Visa goes, what if these companies disappear? Yeah. There's no guarantee that any of these people, frankly, the whole stock market's going to zero. Yeah. Nobody knows who's surviving the coming AI tsunami. Yeah. What's going to make it and what's not going to make it. So you want something that is outside of that. You want something that operates independent from anybody else. Yeah, it doesn't have to be for nefarious reasons. It's, I just got a toaster. I want to pay for some electricity. I got a bath. I want to heat up some water. I got I got this computer. I want to pay per byte in real time for my internet connection. Can I do that without having to worry about some? Because you can't have a centralized server that could do that. There's just too much traffic. Whereas on a decentralized system, you could do it.
Yeah.
But then you can't be in the middle of that transaction. Yeah. So you sort of decentralize it. You make it resilient. You make it distributed, decentralized, and then it works. But to do that, you have to have a system that fits on a chip, which is what Minima does.
Right. So that's the partnership that you have or coming up with ARM, right? That's the one you just discussed.
Yeah, they like it. They want to put it on chips and stuff. And, we're going to have to see how that goes.
Yeah. So for anyone who is not aware of ARM, they are the creators and designers of both CPUs and GPUs out of UK, right? And they then license this technology to companies like Apple.
They're
Samsung.
the phone. They do all the phones, basically. What you really want is for them, they shouldn't need my permission. They don't need my permission. It's not like I'm in charge of this. Yeah. What we want is for them to just say, wow, this is great tech. We're going to do it because ARM is great. It's fantastic. I love it. They own the entire phone market. Every phone basically in the West uses an ARM chip. And if you can get on that, that gives you, that gives you serious power on your network, because it means that when you run it on a chip in hardware, rather than running it in software through 17 different layers, it's 10,000 times more efficient. Yeah. And you can actually do it without even having to break a sweat. It operates in a level where maybe my mother could deal with this. Yeah. Without having to worry about seed phrases and stuff and, blah, blah, blah.
That's tough. Yeah.
It's funny actually, because I suppose for me that at the end of the day, what I think, if I'm going to be honest, the problem is the seed phrase. And what I mean by that is that self-sovereignty, being in charge of your own stuff, requires you to be in charge of your own stuff. And a lot of people can't handle that. They don't want that. That's why Coinbase is bigger than everything else put together. Because when I say to you, you're in charge, and they're like, I love it. I want to be in charge. And it's like, nobody can take your stuff. And it's like, yes. And it's like, but you have to remember these 24 words. They're like, what if I lose the words? And it's like, you need some way of getting over that, that thing. And a lot of people can't handle it. Not yet. If it was biometric on my blood with DNA, so I didn't have to worry about it, or my iris scan or something. And I think that's the challenge over the next 10, 15 years. Yeah. We need to come up with a way of making this accessible to the masses. So we've got the tech and it works. Nerds get it. Yeah. We get it. Sorry. I don't know if you're a nerd. I'm a nerd. Yeah. I get it. I can do it, but we're not at the level yet where other people can just freely use it the way they use WhatsApp. Yeah. And it's got to be as simple as that without them worrying about it, and still keep their sovereignty, and still make it that no one can pinch their money, which I know there is a solution to.
No, not quite there. So look, I think I can spend probably 2 more hours with you here, but I do want to wrap this up. So let me ask you this question. So you talked about ARM partnership, right? When can we actually get to see the hardware? When it's gonna? Do you know the timeline?
I can't actually say anything about that partnership.
You cannot, you're under NDAs?
No, we're always told, don't say anything. It's like, all right, I talk tech, I do the maths. Hugo, the CEO, he does the money. He does all that business stuff. I do the tech set. And I'm the one that got it on the chip, and I go and I meet all the nerds and we talk about it and we squish it and we make it this and all of that. But the actual business side of it, I find quite boring, if I'm honest. I think the cars like it, and I like the car angle as well, because the car's got a big battery and it's got a computer and we know it works. And it's like, how can we make this? Like, I'll tell you what I think is like, when you've got a blockchain in a car, we're sitting here thinking, if you did this, then maybe we can do this and that. And actually, what I think the interesting part is that once you've got it in, there's 1,000 different things that people are going to come up with that you can do. Maybe when I drive past a car, it can ask me for data and I can say, I'll give it to you. You got to pay me. Who knows the derivative thing they're going to pop out of this. So I'm more interested in coming up with the technology at the base, which people can then build on top of. And we are not the ones, I'm sorry to say, Minima Global, I'm not the one to come up with the 1,000 different things that you can do with this. The human race is the one that needs to come up with all the clever stuff. But I know that once you have Trojan horsed a blockchain onto every single computer device on the planet, there's going to be things that you can do that I can't even imagine.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine them. Otherwise, I tell you what they are. But it's like, I can't imagine what they're going to be. But it's like, wow. So the internet gave us information. Yeah. The internet was brilliant because it came along and now we have this sort of information superhighway where we can all send each other data.